I'm a 42-year-old man who thought he had a pretty good read on people. Spent 20 years as a network engineer building systems that catch errors before they become disasters. Turns out I was a lot better at debugging computers than I was at reading my own wife. My wife and I had been married for 11 years. We met at a friend's wedding in Phoenix. She was a bridesmaid. I was the guy who fixed the DJ's laptop when it crashed, 20 minutes before the reception. She laughed at that. Said she'd never seen anyone look so calm under pressure. We did it for 2 years before I proposed on a hiking trail outside Sedona. Just the two of us and a ring I'd been carrying in my pack for 3 weeks waiting for the right moment. For the first 6 years, I genuinely believed we had something solid. We bought a house in a quiet suburb outside Denver. We had 2 kids, a son who just turned 9 and a daughter who's 7. My wife worked part-time as a dental hygienist. I worked from home most days, and on weekends we'd take the kids to the park or drive up into the mountains. It wasn't flashy. It was ours. Then somewhere around year 7, the temperature dropped. Not all at once, more like a slow leak you don't notice until the tire is flat. She stopped asking about my day. Stopped sitting next to me on the couch. The bedroom became a place where we slept on opposite edges of a king-size mattress like 2 countries with a disputed border. I tried to talk about it. She said she was tired. Said work was stressful. Said I was being too sensitive. I went to therapy on my own for a while. Then I suggested couples counseling, and she agreed, but sat through 6 sessions with her arms crossed, giving one-word answers. The therapist eventually pulled me aside and gently said that progress required both people to participate. That was the end of the sessions. By year 9, I had stopped trying to figure out what was wrong and started just managing the silence. I focused on the kids. I coached my son's soccer team on Saturday mornings. I made pancakes on Sundays. I told myself this was a phase. A lot of marriages go through phases. What I didn't know was that the phase had a name, and the name was someone she worked with. The way I found out wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no gut feeling, no moment of clarity. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and our family laptop, the shared one we kept on the kitchen counter for the kids' homework, started sending me notifications. My wife had logged into her Google account on it a few weeks earlier to print something, and she'd never logged out. Her emails were syncing to the desktop. I wasn't snooping. I walked over to close the notification and the screen was already open. And right there, in plain text, was a thread with a name I recognized. A guy she worked with. Someone she'd mentioned a handful of times over the past 2 years, always casually. Always just a coworker. The emails went back 14 months. I stood in my kitchen for probably 10 minutes not moving. My son was at soccer practice. My daughter was at my mother-in-law's. The house was completely quiet except for the refrigerator hum. I read enough to understand what I was looking at, and then I closed the laptop and went and sat on the back porch and stared at the yard until the sun started to go down. I want to be honest about something here because I think a lot of men in this situation skip over this part. I did not feel rage right away. What I felt first was a specific kind of grief, the kind where you realize that the thing you thought you were preserving was already gone, that all those months of telling myself it was just a phase, all that energy I'd spent trying to maintain normalcy for the kids, had been spent defending something that had already been hollowed out from the inside. The anger came later. And when it came, I made a decision that changed everything. I did not say a word to my wife that night, or the next day. I called in sick to work, drove to a lawyer's office across town, not the one we'd used for our home purchase, a different one, and I spent 90 minutes explaining the situation. My lawyer was a calm, precise woman who had clearly heard this exact story many times. She did not react with sympathy or outrage. She just asked questions and took notes. Here's what I learned in that meeting. In Colorado, marital misconduct doesn't directly affect asset division, but it can be relevant to custody, and documentation is everything. She told me to start keeping a record. Dates, times, who had the kids, what was said. She told me not to confront my wife yet. She told me to be patient, which was the hardest instruction I'd ever been given. I followed it. For 3 weeks, I kept a daily log in a notes app on my phone. I documented every time my wife left the house in the evening. I noted every time she was absent for bedtime. I recorded the date she came home after 10 p.m. and what reason she gave. I did all of this while making dinner, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories, and pretending that our marriage was the same marriage it had always been. During those 3 weeks, I also quietly contacted our bank and got a full picture of our joint accounts. What I found there hit almost as hard as the emails. Over the previous 8 months, She had moved $43,000 out of our joint savings into an account I didn't have access to. The transfers were small and spread out, 200 here, 800 there. The kind of amounts that don't trigger alerts. The kind someone does when they're planning something. I brought all of this to my lawyer. She stopped taking notes for a moment, looked at me and said, "You did the right thing by coming here first." When I finally had the conversation with my wife, I chose a Sunday evening after the kids were in bed. I had already made copies of everything. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table and I told her I knew. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything. I put a printed copy of the email thread on the table and I watched her face. She went pale. Then she tried the one move I had been prepared for. She got angry at me, said I had violated her privacy, said I had no right to access her account. I let her finish. Then I put a second sheet on the table. The bank transfers. The anger drained out of her face. What followed over the next hour was not what I expected. She didn't beg or cry. She got very quiet and very practical. She said she wanted a divorce, and she intended to get half of everything, including my 401k, and she had already spoken to an attorney. She said she would fight for primary custody of the kids. Then she got up, went to the bedroom, and closed the door. I went back to my lawyer the next morning. Here's where I need to explain something about the custody piece, because this is what mattered most to me. Not the house, not the retirement account. My kids. My son who sleeps with a worn-out stuffed bear he's had since he was 2. My daughter who still asks me to check under her bed every night before she'll turn the light off. I was not going to let someone who had been planning an exit for over a year, while I was coaching soccer and making pancakes, walk out the door with primary custody of my children. My lawyer filed first. We requested a temporary parenting arrangement that reflected actual caregiving history and resubmitted my documentation log as supporting evidence. Her attorney pushed back hard. For about 6 weeks it was genuinely ugly. Then 2 things happened that changed the trajectory. First, the man she had been seeing, the coworker, ended things when the divorce became official and messy. Apparently, the version of their relationship that existed in secret was not the version he wanted when it came with attorneys and court dates. Second, my wife's attorney made the mistake of pushing for a financial settlement that required full forensic accounting of our joint assets, which meant the $43,000 she had quietly moved had to be explained and accounted for. In mediation, her attorney went very quiet for a long time when that number came up. The final agreement took 4 months to reach. I kept the house by buying out her share at a price that accounted for the transferred funds. We settled on a 60-40 custody split in my favor, no alimony in either direction. My 401k stayed intact. On the day she signed the final papers, she didn't say goodbye to the kids before she left the house. My son stood at the front window watching her car pull out of the driveway. I stood behind him with my hand on his shoulder and I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would have helped. That was 8 months ago. Life has rebuilt itself slowly, the way things do after a storm. Not back to what it was, but into something new that you eventually stopped comparing to before. The kids adjusted better than I feared. My son is still playing soccer. My daughter decided she wants to learn to draw horses, and I bought her a sketchbook and some pencils, and now there are horse drawings on the refrigerator. Some mornings it feels remarkably ordinary. I want to end this part by saying one thing directly, because I saw myself in a lot of men I've talked to since this happened. I stayed quiet and managed the silence for years because I kept hoping things would correct themselves. They won't. They never do. If something in your home has gone cold, that cold has a source, and the kindest thing you can do for yourself and your children is find out what it is before you've lost years protecting something that has already been taken from you. Trust your own observations. Document everything. Talk to a lawyer before you say a word. And now I want to tell you about my father. I never expected to be telling this second story. I've been carrying it for about 3 years now, and I'm not sure I've told it in full to anyone. But something about going through my own divorce made me understand it differently, and I think it belongs here. My father was 57 years old when he sat at the kitchen table of the house I grew up in and signed divorce papers. I was 29 at the time, living across the state, and when he called to tell me, his voice had that particular flatness that I now know means a person is holding themselves together by sheer will. He and my mother had been married for 31 years. I won't tell her story. It's not mine to tell. What I will say is that the marriage had been struggling for a long time, that both of them had made mistakes, and that by the time the papers were signed, there was a shared and exhausted agreement between them that this was the end. No villain, no bombshell discovery. Just 31 years of two people slowly becoming strangers and finally acknowledging it. My father moved into a small apartment 20 minutes from the house. He kept going to work. He was a high school history teacher, had been for 26 years. He kept his routines. He called me every Sunday evening. He seemed okay. A little quieter than usual, but okay. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that he had met someone. He didn't tell me about her right away. It was about 4 months after the divorce when he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd been spending time with a woman named Carol. He'd met her at the public library of all places. She was a retired music teacher, widowed 3 years earlier. They'd reached for the same book in the biography section, some biography of a Civil War general he'd been meaning to read for years. And she'd laughed and said she'd found it first, and she'd let him know how it ended. He started telling me about her in pieces over the following weeks. Not gushing, not the way someone younger might talk about a new relationship, more like he was discovering something he thought he'd lost the language for. He said she made him feel like himself, not a younger version of himself, not who he used to be, just himself. At 57, reading history books and grading papers and making terrible coffee, and that being enough. I flew out to visit that Christmas, and I met Carol for the first time. She came to dinner on Christmas Eve. She brought a pie she'd made from scratch and apologized twice for the crust, which was perfect. She and my father sat next to each other at the table and talked and laughed and occasionally got into good-natured arguments about historical facts. And I watched my father's face and saw something I hadn't seen there in years. He was present. Fully. Completely present. I drove back to my hotel that night and sat in the parking lot for a while before going inside. I'm not ashamed to say I cried. Not from sadness. From something more complicated than that. From watching someone you love find their way back to themselves at an age when a lot of people have stopped expecting to. They dated for 2 years. My father proposed on a Tuesday evening at the library where they'd met. He'd apparently planned something more elaborate, but lost his nerve and just asked her while they were sitting in the biography section, which Carol later said was exactly right. They got married the following spring. Small ceremony, 30 people, held outdoors at a park where Carol used to take her piano students for what she called listening walks. She'd have them sit quietly and identify every sound they could hear. My father cried during the vows. I'd never seen him cry before in my life. For 2 years, they were happy in the way that people are happy when they've both been through enough to know not to take it for granted. They took a trip to New England in the fall to see the leaves. They hosted a monthly dinner for retired teachers that eventually grew to 15 people around a table built for 8. They argued about whether Bob Dylan deserved the Nobel Prize. My father said yes. Carol said the committee should have given it to someone who actually sat still while they sang. I called them every Sunday evening now, both of them. And those calls became the part of my week I look forward to most. Then, at a routine checkup 16 months into their marriage, Carol's doctor found something. My father called me that evening. He used the same flat voice he'd used to tell me about the divorce. I recognized it immediately this time. The diagnosis was serious. The kind you don't negotiate with, only manage. Carol had known something was off for a few months, but had been attributing it to other things, the way people do when they're afraid of what the alternative explanation might be. By the time they caught it, it had already spread. I flew out the following weekend. Carol was home, sitting in their living room in a wide chair by the window with afternoon light coming in and a book open on her lap. She looked thinner than the last time I'd seen her, and there was a particular kind of tired in her face that I recognized from people I've known who carried something heavy. But she smiled when I walked in, and it was the same smile from Christmas Eve, genuine and unhurried. She said, "Your father has been cooking every meal from scratch since the diagnosis. And I keep telling him I'm sick, not helpless." My father, from the kitchen, said something back that made her laugh. I spent 3 days with them. I helped my father research treatment centers and drove them to a consultation appointment across town where we sat in a waiting room for 2 hours and then spent 45 minutes with a specialist who spoke carefully and honestly. Carol asked good questions. My father took notes on a legal pad, the same way he'd taken notes in a classroom for 26 years. On the drive home, she sat in the back seat and looked out the window, and after a while she said, quietly, "I want to go back to New England in the fall, one more time." My father said without hesitating, "Then we go." It went in October. I have a photo my father sent me from that trip. The two of them sitting on a bench somewhere in Vermont, surrounded by red and gold, Carol in a green coat, my father's arm around her, both of them looking at the camera, both of them smiling. I keep it on my desk. She declined steadily through the winter. My father reduced his teaching schedule and then took a leave of absence entirely. He cooked, drove her to appointments, read to her in the evenings from whatever she was working through. Biography, mostly, with occasional mystery novels she called palate cleansers. On the days she felt well enough, they would take short walks in the neighborhood, slow ones, and she would sometimes stop and make him listen for sounds the way she had taught her piano students. He told me he got very good at identifying birds by sound alone. I visited 4 more times over those 8 months. Each time she was smaller, quieter, but present in a way that I found hard to articulate, like someone who has finished being afraid and is simply paying attention. My father was the opposite of what I'd feared. Not broken, not lost. Steady, quiet in a different way than after the divorce. Not the flatness of someone holding themselves together, but the stillness of someone who has decided that being here, completely, is the one thing they can offer. One evening late in March, I was sitting with Carol in the living room while my father made dinner. She'd been drifting in and out of sleep. I thought she was asleep when she said, without opening her eyes, "He was so lonely when I met him. I could see it like a coat he was wearing that was too heavy." She paused. "Make sure he doesn't put it back on." I told her he wouldn't. She passed away on a Tuesday morning in April, at home with my father beside her. He called me 20 minutes later, and this time his voice wasn't flat. It was broken open in the way that only happens when what you've lost was fully real. The service was small as she would have wanted. Afterward, back at the house, after everyone had gone, my father and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee, and he didn't say much. He picked up a small notebook that had been sitting on the counter. Carol's handwriting on the cover, a list of bird species she'd been keeping track of in their neighborhood. 47 species, logged with dates and weather conditions, and brief notes like, bold, landed on fence post, didn't care about us at all. He held it for a while, without saying anything. Then he said, "I had 31 years and I was sleepwalking through the last 10 of them. I had 2 years with her and I was awake for every single day." He set the notebook down carefully. I think about that a lot. I've thought about it a lot too in the months since, and especially during the harder stretches of my own divorce. What it means to be present in your own life, what it costs when you're not. How grief and gratitude can occupy the same moment, and how the people who've been through the worst sometimes come out the other side with a clarity that the comfortable never have to find. My father still calls me on Sunday evenings. He went back to teaching in the fall part-time, just 2 history classes. He still has the bird notebook, and on the windowsill in his living room there's a single photo from Vermont, 2 people on a bench surrounded by fall color, which is, I think, exactly the right amount. He told me recently he started going back to the library on Saturday mornings, not looking for anything, just present, just awake. That's enough, I think. That's everything.